The paper shook in my hands. Not a tremor. A convulsion that traveled from my fingertips through my wrists, up my arms, settling like ice in my chest. I stared at the handwriting, each loop and slant as familiar as my own reflection. The ink was blue, pressed deep into cream cardstock, the kind she kept in the mahogany desk by the window where morning light used to catch the dust. I will not attend. 4 words, 23 letters, a lifetime of dismissal. My maid of honor, Rachel, touched my shoulder. Her fingers were warm through the lace sleeve of my dress. I flinched anyway. "You don't have to read it again," she said. But I did. I read it again. And again. As if repetition might rearrange the letters into something bearable. As if the paper might confess why the woman who taught me to tie my shoes, who sat beside my bed through fevered nights, who was the only mother I ever knew, had chosen this day to carve out my heart. "Emma," Rachel's voice dropped. "They're waiting." The chapel doors were closed, but I could hear the murmur of voices beyond. 86 people. I'd counted. 86 witnesses to the empty chair in the front row, left side, where she should have been sitting. Where I'd reserved the seat with a small card written in gold ink, reserved for family. I folded the note. Once, twice. The creases bit into the words, but they didn't disappear. "Does David know?" Rachel asked. "No, Emma. He'll see the chair, he'll understand." I didn't want understanding. I wanted her there. I wanted her hands, gnarled with age and arthritis, folding over mine. I wanted her voice, sharp and certain, telling me to stand up straight, to stop fidgeting, to remember I was made of stronger things than doubt. The organ began. A low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and climbed into my bones. Rachel squeezed my shoulder once more, then slipped through the door. I watched it close behind her. The note was still in my hand, edges damp now from my palm. I tucked it into the bodice of my dress, against my ribs, where it pressed like a second heartbeat. The doors opened. Light poured in. Stained glass fractured the afternoon sun into shards of crimson and gold and deep, bruised violet. The aisle stretched impossibly long. Faces turned toward me, mouths curving into smiles I couldn't return. At the far end, David stood beside the altar, hands clasped, eyes shining. And there, third row, left side, the chair sat empty. I stepped forward. My heels clicked against the stone floor. Someone gasped. I wasn't sure if it was admiration for the dress or pity for the girl inside it. The white fabric pooled around my feet, heavy as shame. I'd chosen this dress with her in mind. Modest neckline, long sleeves. The lace pattern reminded me of the doilies she crocheted every winter, her needles clicking in rhythm with the grandfather clock. Halfway down the aisle, I heard the whisper. "Where's Margaret?" Another voice, closer. Louder, "I heard she's not coming." My throat tightened. The air turned solid, thick as wet wool. I kept walking, one foot, then the other. The bouquet shook in my hands, white roses. She'd grown white roses once, in the garden behind her house, before the thorns grew wild and choked them. David's face came into focus. His eyes asked a question I couldn't answer. Not here, not now. I reached the altar. The priest smiled. He opened his mouth to speak, and the words washed over me like water over stone. I heard none of it. My gaze drifted past David's shoulder, past the rows of pews to that chair. The wood gleamed under the filtered light. The cushion, deep burgundy, looked soft, untouched. "Emma," David's voice, gentle, concerned. I blinked. Everyone was watching. The priest held out his hand, waiting. For what? I'd missed something, a cue, a line. "Your vows," David whispered. Right, my vows. I'd written them on a card tucked into Rachel's clutch, but the words were gone now, burned away by the note still pressed against my ribs. I opened my mouth. "I promise," I said. My voice cracked. I swallowed, tasted salt. "I promise to choose you every day, even when it's hard, even when others don't understand." David's eyes glistened. He thought I was talking about us, about marriage, about the life we'd build. He didn't know I was talking about her. The ceremony blurred, rings exchanged, pronouncements made. David kissed me, and the chapel erupted in applause. Rice fell like snow as we walked back down that aisle, past the empty chair, out into the sunlight where everything was supposed to feel new and bright and possible. In the bridal suite, after the photographs, after the congratulations, after everyone had filed into the reception hall, I locked the door. My hands found the note, still tucked against my ribs. I pulled it free. The paper was wrinkled now, damp, soft as skin. I read it one last time, then I crumpled it. Slowly. My fist closed around the words, crushing them into a tight ball of paper and pain. But I didn't throw it away. I couldn't. She'd raised me, fed me, held me through nightmares, taught me that love meant showing up even when it hurt, especially when it hurt, so I would show up. Every week, if that's what it took, every day. I would sit on her porch, knock on her door, bring her tea and stories and my stubborn, unrelenting presence until she told me why. Until she let me back in. Until she understood that I wasn't going anywhere. She could refuse my wedding, but she couldn't refuse me. I smoothed my dress, tucked the crumpled note into my bouquet, and opened the door. Music drifted up from the reception below. David was waiting. Our guests were waiting. My life was waiting. But in my chest, beneath the lace and the vows and the hope, a new promise burned. I would not give up on her, no matter how long it took, no matter how many doors slammed in my face. She was all I had left of home, and I refused to let her go. The thermos was still warm against my palm when I rang the doorbell. Thursday, 3 o'clock. The same time I used to arrive for our Sunday dinners, back when she still wanted me. The paint on the porch railing flaked under my fingertips. I hadn't noticed that before, or maybe I had and she'd always repaired it. Now a strip of bare wood showed through, gray and splintered. The door opened. She stood in the frame, backlit by the dim hallway behind her. Her cardigan hung loose on shoulders that seemed smaller than I remembered. But her face, God, her face was carved from stone, every line set in granite disapproval. "Grandmother!" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I brought tea. The blend you like with bergamot." She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes traveled from the thermos to my face and back again, as if she were cataloging evidence of some crime. "May I come in?" The seconds stretched. A dog barked 3 houses down. Somewhere a lawnmower growled to life, though the grass in her yard had already grown shin-high, dotted with dandelions gone to seed. She stepped back. Not an invitation, just an absence where her body had been. I crossed the threshold before she could change her mind. The house smelled wrong, stale. The curtains were drawn, turning the afternoon into perpetual dusk. I moved toward the kitchen, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar layout, but she made a small sound in her throat. Not a word, just a noise that stopped me cold. She gestured to the sitting room instead. The clock on the mantel ticked. It had always ticked, but I'd never really heard it before, never counted the seconds the way I did now as I poured tea into the china cups I'd found in the cabinet. She sat in the wing-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, and watched me with the expression of someone observing a stranger perform an inexplicable ritual. I held out her cup. She took it, but her fingers didn't curl around the handle. She just held it suspended, steam rising between us like a ghost. So, I settled onto the sofa, the springs groaning beneath me. We went to the coast for the honeymoon. You would have loved it. There was this little inn with a garden that ran right down to the cliffs, and at sunset the light turned everything gold. Nothing. She stared at a point past my left shoulder. David found this bookshop in town. You know how he loves old books. He's teaching summer school now, American literature to rising sophomores. He bought a first edition Steinbeck and carried it around like it was made of glass. Her jaw clenched. Just a flicker, a tightening of the muscles along her mandible, but I saw it. The cup trembled in her grip. The owner knew your favorite author by heart. David spent an hour talking to him about Hemingway. I thought of you the whole time because you were the one who first read me The Old Man and the Sea. Do you remember? I was 12, and you said some battles are worth fighting even if you lose. The cup rattled against the saucer. She set it down on the side table with a sharp click, tea untouched. Grandmother, I just want to... Don't. Her voice came out rusted, unused. Don't say his name here. I froze. Whose name? Her eyes finally met mine. They were the same gray-blue I remembered, but something Arctic lived in them now, something that made my chest constrict. Your husband's. The word landed like a slap. Not David. Not your partner or your love. Your husband. As if the title itself were an accusation. Why? I leaned forward, desperate to understand. Why does it hurt you that I'm married? You were married. You and grandfather had 40 years together. Her mouth compressed into a bloodless line. She looked away, gaze fixing on the curtained window, and I followed her line of sight to where a thin strip of light penetrated the heavy fabric. Dust motes swirled in the beam, aimless and trapped. The clock ticked. 30 seconds. 60. I tried again, switching tactics, keeping my voice light. I pressed flowers from the garden at the inn. I thought maybe we could frame them for your mantel. There were wild roses, like the ones you used to grow out front. Her fingers dug into the armrests. Those roses are dead. They could bloom again if someone tended them. Some things don't come back. I came back. My throat tightened. I'm here every Thursday. I'll keep coming. She stood abruptly, the movement jerky, uncoordinated. For a dizzy moment, I thought she might fall, but she caught herself against the chair back. Her knuckles went white. You should leave. Grandmother, leave. But I couldn't, not yet. I stood too, closing the distance between us, and she flinched. Actually flinched, as if my proximity were a physical threat. I stopped, hands raised in surrender. What did I do? The words cracked open, exposing the question I'd been carrying since the moment I read her note. Tell me what I did wrong and I'll fix it. Please, just tell me. She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze stayed fixed on that strip of light, her jaw working as if she were chewing words too bitter to swallow. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. You didn't do anything wrong. Hope flared in my chest. Then why? That's why. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. That's exactly why. Before I could parse the meaning, she moved past me, her footsteps unsteady on the carpet. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of overgrown grass and rot. "Thursday," she said, not a question. Not quite a statement either. Something in between. A test, maybe, or a dare. 3 o'clock, I confirmed. She nodded once, a movement so slight I might have imagined it. Then the door closed, and I was standing on the porch again, the thermos still half full of cooling tea in my hands. I made it to the car before the first sob broke free. My forehead pressed against the steering wheel, shoulders heaving, and the truth settled over me like a burial shroud. She hadn't said no. Hadn't said don't come back. Hadn't severed the thread completely. But she'd given me nothing. No explanation. No softness. Just that impossible riddle, you didn't do anything wrong. That's why my phone buzzed. David. Checking in, asking how it went, probably words of comfort already forming in his mind. I couldn't answer. Not yet. Not when I didn't know whether this visit counted as success or failure, whether the door cracked open a millimeter or slammed shut forever. I looked back at the house. The curtains were still drawn. The garden still choked with weeds. But in the front window, just for a second, I saw a shadow. A silhouette backlit by that sliver of light, standing motionless, watching. I lifted my hand in a wave. The shadow didn't move. I started the engine, tears still streaming, and drove home through blurred streets, already counting the days until next Thursday. I drove home that first Thursday with salt tracks drying on my cheeks and a single word echoing in my skull. Thursday. Not goodbye, not never. Thursday. David met me at the door, his teacher's patience already worn thin by the smell of bergamot still clinging to my cardigan. I shook my head before he could ask. He pulled me close anyway, his heartbeat steady against my ear while mine hammered irregular rhythms of failure and fragile hope. "She said Thursday," I whispered into his chest. He kissed the top of my head. "Then we'll take Thursday." The following week, I returned. Grandmother opened the door wearing the same cardigan, the same expression carved from granite. We sat on the porch. I talked about the leak in our bathroom, the neighbor's cat, anything harmless. She stared at the dead rose bushes lining the walkway, their skeletal branches clawing at October air. When I left, she said nothing, but she didn't tell me to stop coming. Thursday became my religion. By mid-November, frost glittered on the porch floorboards. I brought a thermos of soup. Grandmother accepted it with hands that looked smaller than I remembered, the skin paper thin and mapped with veins like blue rivers. She set the thermos beside her rocking chair, never opened it. We sat in silence while my breath made ghosts in the air and hers came shallow, reluctant. "The maples are turning," I said, gesturing to the street. Her jaw tightened. "They do that." It wasn't conversation, but it was sound shaped in response to my presence, and I hoarded it like treasure. December arrived with snow that she didn't shovel. I cleared her walkway before knocking, my gloves soaked through, fingers burning. She watched from the window, face half hidden behind heavy curtains that blocked out the watery winter light. When she opened the door, something flickered across her features, almost like guilt. It vanished before I could name it. "You'll catch cold," she said. "So will you if you slip on ice." She turned away, but left the door open long enough for me to glimpse the hallway beyond. Mail scattered on the side table, envelopes still sealed. A coat rack listing sideways, heavy with coats she never wore. The house exhaled stale air that smelled of dust and something sour I couldn't identify. Then the door closed and she emerged onto the porch bundled in a threadbare wool coat. We sat. The silence felt different that day, heavier, like a held breath stretching too long. "David made Christmas cookies," I ventured, pulling out a tin. "Gingerbread. He remembered you used to make them." Her hands trembled when she reached for the tin, not from cold. The tremor started deep, somewhere in the bones, and radiated outward until she had to grip the armrests of her rocking chair to steady herself. The tin sat unopened in her lap. "I don't make them anymore," she said. "Why not?" The question hung between us, small and sharp. She didn't answer, but her knuckles whitened against the wood, and I saw the tendons in her neck pull taut. I stopped asking harmless questions after that. January turned the world colorless. Gray sky, gray snow, gray exhaustion settling into my marriage like sediment. David stopped asking how the visits went. I stopped pretending they went well. But every Thursday at 3 o'clock, I drove to that Victorian house with its peeling paint and its woman made of winter, and I sat on that porch until my legs went numb. Grandmother grew thinner. Her coat swallowed her frame. The trembling in her hands spread to her voice, made her words quaver when she spoke, which was rare. Mostly she rocked in her chair, the runners groaning against warped floorboards, creating a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat struggling. "Are you eating?" I asked one gray afternoon. "Enough. Are you sleeping?" "Enough. Grandmother." I leaned forward, forcing her to meet my eyes. "What's happening to you?" She looked at me then, really looked. Her eyes, the same hazel as mine, held something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not coldness, terror, raw and animal, and quickly shuddered. "Nothing that concerns you." But it did. It consumed me. I started arriving early, watching from my car. She moved through the house like a ghost, visible through gaps in the curtains. Some days she stood motionless in the parlor for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep upright. Other days I didn't see her at all, and my chest would constrict until she finally appeared at the door, alive but diminished. February brought a thaw. Water dripped from eaves, carved rivulets through melting snow. The dead garden emerged from its white burial shroud, revealing neglect. Rose bushes choked with weeds. Flower beds strangled by deadfall. The lawn patchy and sickly where it showed through. I knelt in the mud that Thursday, started pulling weeds from the nearest bed. Grandmother stood at the door, watching. "Leave it," she called, her voice sharp. "It's no trouble." I said leave it. I sat back on my heels, mud soaking through my jeans. "Why, you loved these gardens. You taught me the name of every flower here." She gripped the door frame. "That was a long time ago. It was 4 years ago, before grandfather died." Something crumpled in her face. She turned away, but I was already standing, already climbing the porch steps with dirt under my fingernails and desperation making me reckless. "What happened?" I demanded. "What happened that made you stop living?" She froze, one hand on the door handle. "Was it grandfather's death? Was it me getting married? What did I do that made you disappear?" Her shoulders rose and fell, a single sharp breath. When she spoke, her voice came from someplace deep and damaged. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Then what?" She shook her head, the motion small and fractured. "Please," I whispered. "I'm losing you. You're breaking right in front of me, and I don't know why. Just tell me why." For one suspended moment, I thought she would. Her mouth opened. Her eyes, wet now, found mine. Decades pressed against her teeth, trying to escape. Then her jaw locked. Her spine straightened. The door opened. "Thursday," she said, and walked inside, leaving me alone on the porch with mud on my knees and my grandmother's grief hanging in the March air like smoke. Now I'll write chapter 4, applying all the techniques. I found them in the attic above our spare bedroom. 3 photo albums, leather bindings cracked like dried riverbeds, the smell of mildew rising from the cardboard box David pulled down for me. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light as I opened the first one. My mother at 6 years old, gap-toothed and laughing. My grandmother's hand resting on her shoulder, fingers relaxed in a way I'd never seen them. I closed the album, pressed my palm flat against the warped cover. David leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You think she'll even look at them? I don't know. The leather felt warm under my hand. But I saw something last week, in the garden. She almost spoke. Almost isn't enough, Em. It's more than I've gotten in 6 months. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the frame, came to sit beside me on the dusty floor. His shoulder pressed against mine, solid and patient. Just don't expect too much, please. I couldn't promise him that. Expecting too much was the only thing keeping me going. Thursday arrived with rain that turned the unpaved shoulder near her house into soup. My tires threw up mud as I pulled off the road. The albums sat on the passenger seat, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag against the weather. Through the windshield, the house looked smaller than usual, paint peeling faster than memory could keep up with. She answered on the 3rd knock. You're early. Her voice carried its usual frost, but her eyes darted to the bag in my hands. What's that? Can I come in? No, Grandma, it's pouring. The porch has a roof. She stepped back, already closing the door to a crack. Wait. I pulled one album from the bag, held it where she could see. Water droplets beaded on the plastic covering the leather. I found these. I thought you might want to see them. Her hand, already pushing the door shut, stopped. Her knuckles went white against the wood. Photos, I said, of Mom and you. From before. The word before hung in the wet air between us. Before what I couldn't say. Before me, before Grandfather died, before whatever had calcified her heart into stone. She stared at the album. The tendons in her neck stood out like cables. Please, I whispered. The door opened wider. Not an invitation, but not a refusal either. I stepped onto the porch before she could change her mind. The rain drummed on the roof above us, loud enough to make the silence between us feel almost comfortable. I sat in my usual chair, set the bag on the small wicker table between us, pulled out all 3 albums. Their covers were different colors, different decades. The oldest one, forest green with gold embossing worn nearly invisible, I placed on top. She lowered herself into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had started betraying them. Her gaze never left the albums. That one's from the 1960s, I think, I said. Based on the clothes. She didn't reach for it. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair instead, those trembling fingers I'd noticed weeks ago now visibly shaking. I opened the green album myself. The binding cracked softly. The first page held a wedding photo, formal and stiff. My grandmother in white lace, her expression serene and empty. Grandfather beside her in a dark suit, his hand on her waist positioned like a claim of ownership. Neither of them smiled. You looked beautiful, I said. I looked like a lie. The words came out so quietly I almost missed them under the rain. I turned to stare at her. Her face had gone pale, eyes fixed on the photograph with an intensity that made my chest tighten. What do you mean? She didn't answer. Her hand lifted from the chair arm, reached toward the album, then pulled back as if the pages might burn her. I turned to the next page. More wedding photos. Reception tables with centerpieces of white roses. Grandfather cutting the cake, his smile not reaching his eyes. My grandmother in every shot looked like a porcelain doll, perfect and lifeless. Then I turned another page and she lunged. The movement was so sudden I gasped. Her hands shot out and snatched the album from my lap, clutching it against her chest with both arms. The chair rocked beneath her. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. "Grandma, don't," her voice cracked. "Don't look at these." But I'd already seen what had triggered her. On that page, tucked among the formal wedding portraits, was a different photo. Smaller, the edges worn soft from handling. My grandmother at maybe 25, standing in a field of wild flowers, head thrown back in genuine laughter. The joy in her face was so raw, so completely unguarded, that it looked like a different person entirely. She was alone in the photo, but the angles suggested someone had been standing very close when they took it. "Who took that picture?" I leaned forward in my chair, my heart hammering. "Grandma, who were you laughing for?" She curled around the album like it was a child she needed to protect. Her shoulders shook. For a horrible moment, I thought she was crying, but when she lifted her face, her eyes were dry. Bright and terrible and dry. "You think you understand love," she whispered. "You think because you chose it, you know what it costs. Tell me." I slid from my chair, knelt on the wet porch boards in front of her. "Please, help me understand." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Duty," she said finally, and the words sounded like broken glass. "When they tell you duty matters more than your heart, you believe them. You believe them because you're young and they're your parents and you think they must know better. Who told you that? Everyone." Her laugh was bitter, airless. "Everyone who mattered. Everyone who had power over my life. And grandfather. Your grandfather was duty." She pressed the album harder against her chest, right over her heart. "Your grandfather was what I was supposed to want, what I was supposed to choose, what I was supposed to be grateful for." The rain intensified, sheeting off the porch roof in a silver curtain that enclosed us in our own small world. My knees ached against the floorboards, but I didn't move. Couldn't move. This was the closest she'd ever come to the truth. "But you wanted something else," I said softly. Her eyes met mine. For 3 heartbeats, I saw straight through to the grief she'd buried for decades. Saw the girl in the wildflower field. Saw the choice that had destroyed her. "Wanting doesn't matter." Her voice dropped even lower, nearly lost under the rain. "What you want doesn't matter when they've already decided your life for you. When they've already signed the papers and sent the invitations and told the whole town who you're going to be. That's not fair." "Fair." She almost smiled. Almost. "You think love is about fair. You think your little rebellion, your precious choice to marry that man, you think that makes you brave. You don't know what it costs to give up everything. You don't know what it does to you, year after year, waking up next to someone who isn't." She stopped, bit down on the words so hard I heard her teeth click together. "Who isn't what?" My voice came out desperate. "Grandma, who wasn't he?" But the door had slammed shut behind her eyes. She stood abruptly, the album still clutched to her chest, and I had to scramble backward to avoid being knocked over. She stepped past me, moved to the front door. Her free hand fumbled with the knob. "You need to leave." "No, not now. Not when you're finally. Leave." She wrenched the door open, disappeared into the darkness of the house. I heard her footsteps receding down the hall, fast and uneven. Heard a door slam deeper inside. Then nothing but rain. I stood slowly, my knees stiff and wet. Through the doorway, I could see nothing but shadows. The house had swallowed her whole. "I'm not giving up," I called into the darkness. "I'll come back next Thursday. I'll keep coming back." No response. I gathered the other 2 albums, wrapped them back in the plastic bag. My hands shook as badly as hers had. Through the open door, I heard something I'd never heard before. A lock clicking into place. Not the front door, somewhere deep in the house. A lock on something she needed to keep hidden. I walked back to my car through the rain, soaked to the skin by the time I reached it. But as I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph, about the wildflower field, about the way she'd clutched the album over her heart like it was the only thing keeping her alive. And I couldn't stop wondering who she'd been laughing for, in that moment before duty taught her to stop laughing altogether. Winter came fast that year, swallowing the town in gray. I pulled my coat tighter as I climbed the porch steps that Thursday, ice crackling under my boots. The wind cut through the gaps in the railing, sharp enough to sting. Dead rose bushes rattled like bones in their beds. I knocked 3 times, my knuckles raw from the cold. No answer. I knocked again, louder. The wind swallowed the sound. My breath fogged the window as I pressed close, peering through the gap in the curtains. Darkness, the kind that felt deliberate, as if the house itself had turned inward. "Grandmother!" My voice cracked against the storm. Nothing. My heart kicked harder. She always answered. Even when her face stayed stone cold. Even when she sent me away before I could finish my tea. She always came to the door. I fumbled in my purse for the key she'd given me years ago, back when I was in high school and she'd first started forgetting things. "Emergency only," she'd said. The metal was ice against my palm. The lock turned with a grinding click. The hallway inside smelled wrong. Stale air, sour with something I couldn't name. No warmth from the radiators. I flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. "Grandmother!" I moved through the dark, one hand trailing the wallpaper, feeling the familiar ridges and tears. The living room was a cave of shadows, furniture crouched like sleeping animals. The kitchen was worse. Dishes piled in the sink, the faucet dripping a slow metronome of neglect. My throat tightened. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step louder than the last. At the top, a thin line of gray light leaked from beneath her bedroom door. I pushed it open. She was in bed, a small mound beneath quilts that rose and fell in shallow, rapid beats. Her face was turned toward the window, skin slack and pale as candle wax. Sweat darkened her hair against the pillow. "Grandmother!" I rushed to her side, pressed my hand to her forehead. She was burning. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her lips moved, shaping silent words. I leaned closer, my ear near her mouth. "Duty," she whispered. Then, softer. "Gone." Panic spiked through me. I grabbed my phone. No signal. The storm must have taken out the tower. I needed medicine. Fever reducer, something, anything. I yanked open the drawer of her nightstand. Empty pill bottles, expired labels, a tangle of rosary beads. Nothing useful. I moved to the dresser, pawing through folded scarves and mothballs. My hands shook as I opened the closet, scanning shelves stacked with shoeboxes and forgotten linens. Where did she keep it? There had to be a medicine cabinet somewhere. I knelt beside the bed, checking underneath. Dust bunnies, a single slipper. Then my knee pressed against something that gave. The baseboard shifted under my weight. I froze. The wood panel sat loose, a finger's width gap separating it from the wall. I pressed harder. It tilted inward with a soft creak, revealing a dark hollow behind. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reached inside, fingers brushing something smooth. Paper. I pulled it free, and a photograph slid into my palm, edges soft with age. The breath left my body. A young woman stood in a field of wildflowers, her head thrown back in laughter. She wore a pale dress, sleeveless, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders. And beside her, his arm wrapped around her waist, was a man with dark eyes and calloused hands, his smile so wide it looked like joy might crack him open. My grandmother, but not the woman I knew. This woman glowed. Her face was unguarded, radiant with something so raw it hurt to look at. The man held her like she was the only true thing in the world. I turned the photograph over. The handwriting was faded, ink bleeding into the yellowed paper, but the words were still clear. Always yours. My hands trembled. The man in the photograph was not my grandfather. I knew my grandfather's face from a dozen framed portraits downstairs. Severe, distant. This man was someone else entirely. Behind me, my grandmother stirred, her breath rattling wet in her chest. I looked down at the photograph again, at the way her younger self leaned into him, at the way his fingers pressed into the fabric of her dress like he was memorizing the shape of her. Who was he, and why had she hidden him behind the walls of this house for so long? The photograph trembled in my hands. The edges were soft, worn thin by decades hidden behind that baseboard. I looked from the image to my grandmother's face, pale against the pillow, her eyes glassy with fever. She saw what I held. Her body went rigid, then something collapsed behind her eyes. "Where did you find that?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. I knelt beside the bed, the wood floor cold through my jeans. Behind the loose board. I was looking for medicine. I turned the photograph so she could see it properly. "Who is he?" Her hand shot out, faster than I thought possible in her weakened state. She tried to snatch it from me. Missed. Her arm dropped back to the blanket, trembling. "Give it to me. Grandmother." I kept my voice soft, but I didn't move. "Talk to me, please." She turned her head away. A minute passed. 2. The only sound was the wind rattling the windows, the storm still howling outside. Then I heard it, a sound I'd never heard from her before. A sob, raw and broken, like something tearing. His name was Daniel. The words hung in the frigid air between us. I waited, barely breathing. "Daniel!" She said it again, tasting the syllables like a prayer she'd forbidden herself for 50 years. "Daniel Hayes." I looked down at the photograph. The man's face was turned slightly toward the camera, caught mid-laugh. His hands, broad and calloused, held my grandmother's waist. She was radiant in a way I'd never seen, not in any family album, not in any memory. He was a carpenter. She pressed her eyes shut, but tears leaked from the corners anyway. Worked with his father. They were good people. Honest. Poor. The word dropped like a stone. Your great-grandfather owned half the businesses in town. My mother wore pearls to breakfast. Her breath hitched. Daniel showed up one summer to rebuild our back porch. I brought him lemonade. He smiled at me like I was something precious, not a prize to be displayed. I sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. Her fever radiated through the blankets, but I stayed close. She didn't pull away. We met in secret for 2 years. The old mill, the woods behind the church, anywhere we wouldn't be seen. Her voice was steadier now, as if the fever had burned away whatever locks had kept this buried. He asked me to marry him. I said yes, but you didn't. My father found out. The bitterness in her voice could have curdled milk. Someone saw us, told him. He called Daniel to the house. I listened from the stairs, heard every word. Heard my father offer him money to leave town. Heard Daniel refuse. Then heard my father threaten to destroy his family's business, ruin his father's reputation, make sure they'd never work again. My chest tightened. What did Daniel do? He came to me that night, climbed the tree outside my window like he'd done 100 times before. She opened her eyes, staring at the ceiling. He begged me to run away with him. Said we could go west, start over, that love was worth more than money or reputation. I already knew how this ended. The photograph in my hands, hidden for decades. The cold house, the bitter silence, but I needed to hear it. Why didn't you go? Her jaw clenched. For a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then her hand found mine, gripping with surprising strength. Because I was a coward. The words came out flat, final. My mother cried. Said I'd kill her if I brought shame on the family. My father said he'd disown me, that I'd be nothing without the family name. They'd already arranged everything. Robert, the wedding, the merger of two proper families. Robert, my grandfather, the man whose portrait still hung in the hallway downstairs, stern and distant even in oil paint. I told Daniel I couldn't. Her voice broke again. I stood in my bedroom in my nightgown, and I told the only man I ever loved that duty mattered more than my heart. I watched him climb back down that tree. I watched him walk away. The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if the world itself was listening. He left town 2 days later. I married your grandfather 6 months after that. She pulled her hand from mine, pressed it against her chest. I wore white. I smiled for the photographs. I stood beside a man I barely knew and promised forever. And Daniel was gone. Did you ever see him again? No, the word was hollow. I heard years later he'd settled somewhere out west, married, had a life. She turned her face back to me, and the anguish in her eyes made my throat close. I chose duty, Emma. I chose what I was supposed to want, and it killed everything inside me. I thought of my own wedding day, David waiting at the altar, the empty chair in the front row, the note that had cut so deep. Is that why you didn't come? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Because I chose differently. Her eyes widened. Something flickered across her face, sharp and panicked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hand moved to her stomach, pressing there as if something hurt. Grandmother, you don't understand. Her voice dropped to barely audible. You don't know what she stopped, swallowed hard. What I sacrificed. The way she said it sent ice down my spine. There was something more, something beneath the story she'd just told. Something that made her press her hand to her stomach like she was protecting a wound. What else? I leaned closer. What aren't you telling me? She turned away again, her shoulders shaking. Outside, the wind picked up, screaming against the house like something desperate to get in. Her hand stayed pressed against her stomach. That small, protective gesture I'd seen 100 times before, usually when she was anxious or upset. But now, watching her fingers curl into the thin cotton of her nightgown, I understood it wasn't anxiety. It was memory. What sacrifice? I leaned forward, my knees pressing into the edge of her bed. The photograph of Daniel lay face up on her quilt, his smile frozen in a summer that never ended. Grandmother, what aren't you telling me? She turned her head away. Sweat dampened her silver hair, plastering thin strands to her temples. The fever hadn't broken yet. Outside, wind rattled the windows, throwing shadows across the faded wallpaper. Leave it alone. I can't. My voice came out sharper than I intended. You've kept me at arm's length for 2 years. You wouldn't come to my wedding. You barely speak to me. And now I find out you had this whole other life, this love you gave up. I picked up the photograph, held it between us. But there's more. I can see it in your face. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought she'd order me out, the way she had so many times before. But her strength was draining away with each labored breath. The fortress she'd built around herself had cracks now, and the fever was widening them. He left. Her voice broke on the words. Daniel left town in September of 1967. I married your grandfather in October. I know, you told me. October 19th. She drew in a shaking breath. A month later, I knew. The room went silent except for the wind. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. Knew what? She closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her weathered cheek, disappearing into the pillow. I was carrying his child. The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples spread outward, reshaping everything I thought I understood. My hands went numb. The photograph slipped from my fingers, fluttering back onto the quilt. You were pregnant. I couldn't make it a question. The truth was already rewriting itself across her face. When you married grandfather. Yes, and my mother. My throat closed around the words. I had to force them out. My mother was Daniel's daughter. She nodded once. Sharp. Final, I stood up. The floor tilted beneath me. I gripped the bedpost, the wood solid under my palm, the only real thing in a room where reality had just crumbled. My mother. The woman who died when I was 3, whose face I barely remembered except from photographs. She'd been born from this forbidden love, this secret that had been buried so deep I'd lived my entire life on top of it without knowing. Did he know? My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Did Daniel know about the baby? No. The word came out as a whisper. He was already gone. I never told him. But grandfather, I turned back to face her. He knew. Something flickered in her eyes, shame maybe, or resignation. He knew. How? I told him. She struggled to sit up. I moved to help her, but she waved me off with a trembling hand. 3 weeks before the wedding, I went to his office downtown. He was sorting through contracts, wearing that gray suit he always wore for business meetings. I stood in the doorway and I told him I couldn't marry him, that I was carrying another man's child. The radiator hissed in the corner. Outside, a branch scraped against the window, a sound like fingernails on glass. What did he say? He asked if the father was coming back. Her voice had gone flat, drained of emotion. I said no. He was gone for good. Then your grandfather looked at me for a long time. He was calculating, I could see it in his eyes. The cost of scandal, the value of our family's merger, the weight of reputation. She picked up Daniel's photograph, her fingers stroking the edge as if she could touch the man himself. He said we'd marry as planned, that he'd raise the child as his own, that no one would ever know, and in exchange I would never speak Daniel's name again. I would be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect lie. My stomach twisted. And you agreed. What choice did I have? Her eyes flashed with sudden anger, bright despite the fever. My parents had already cut me off from Daniel. They'd made it clear what would happen if I brought shame to the family. And I was 19 years old, pregnant, alone. Your grandfather offered me survival, so I took it. The anger faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only exhaustion. She sank back against the pillows. Your mother was born 6 months after the wedding. Premature, we told everyone. She was small enough that people believed it, and your grandfather kept his word. He raised her as his daughter, put her through school, walked her down the aisle at her own wedding. But the secret poisoned everything. I said it quietly, seeing it now with terrible clarity. The cold distance in every family photograph, my grandmother's rigid control, the way she'd never seemed to breathe freely, even in her own home. Every day, her voice cracked. Every single day, I looked at your mother and saw Daniel's eyes staring back at me. I loved her desperately, but she was also a constant reminder of everything I'd lost, everything I'd chosen to give up. And your grandfather, she shook her head. He never let me forget his generosity. Never said it outright, but it was there in every silence. Every polite, distant dinner. I owed him. My whole life became a debt I could never repay. I sat back down on the edge of the bed. My legs wouldn't hold me anymore. And when I told you I was getting married, you were glowing. The words came out like an accusation. You came to this house, sat on that porch, and told me you'd chosen David, that your father disapproved because David wasn't wealthy enough, wasn't connected enough. But you were marrying him anyway. She met my eyes then, and I saw 50 years of buried grief staring back at me. You chose love, she whispered. You chose it knowing the cost. And I couldn't bear to watch you live the life I'd been too afraid to fight for. The photograph lay between us on the quilt, Daniel's face staring up through the decades. My mother's father. A stranger whose blood I carried, whose love had been snuffed out before it could bloom into the family it should have created. Grandmother's breathing had steadied after the confession, but her hands still trembled against the bedspread. The fever had broken days ago, yet she looked more fragile than when I'd found her burning with illness. Some wounds ran deeper than any infection. I should have left her to rest. Should have gathered the shattered pieces of my understanding and walked away to process them alone. But the questions scraped against my ribs, demanding release. Why did you stay bitter? Her eyes snapped to mine, watery, guarded. You knew what grandfather was, I continued, my voice softer than the accusation churning in my chest. You knew the bargain was poison. But you had choices after he died. You could have told Mom the truth. You could have tried to find Daniel. You could have. Choices. The word came out sharp as broken glass. You think I had choices? You had 10 years without him. I gestured toward where grandfather's portrait had once hung in the hallway, removed after his death, leaving only a pale rectangle on the wallpaper. 10 years before I got married. 10 years to let go of whatever kept you locked in that bitterness. Grandmother turned her face toward the window. Late afternoon sun filtered through the heavy curtains, catching the silver in her hair, the deep grooves bracketing her mouth. She looked carved from stone, ancient. You want to know why I stayed bitter? Her voice dropped to something barely audible. Why I couldn't let it go, even after Robert was in the ground and the debt was paid. I waited. My heart hammered against my sternum. She looked back at me, and something in her expression made my breath catch. Not anger. Not the familiar wall of ice she'd built between us for 2 years. This was rawer, more dangerous. Because you made it look so easy. The words hit like a slap. I opened my mouth, but she kept going, her voice gaining speed, cracking at the edges. You came to me that spring, glowing like a girl in a fairy tale, and told me you'd met someone. David, a teacher with kind eyes and empty pockets and no family connections worth mentioning. She laughed, but it sounded like something dying. And I waited for reality to catch you. Waited for your practical side to surface, for you to see that love without security is just pretty words that curdle in the daylight. Grandmother, but you didn't see it. Her hands fisted in the quilt. You just kept glowing, kept making plans, kept choosing him over and over like it was the simplest thing in the world. Like there was no choice at all because of course you would marry the man you loved. Of course you would. The bitterness in her voice could have stripped paint. I felt myself leaning back, instinctively creating distance from the venom, but I forced myself still. Forced myself to witness whatever was finally breaking free. And I hated you for it. The confession hung in the air between us, ugly and true. I hated you, she repeated, quieter now, because you had the courage I never did, because you were willing to risk everything I was too afraid to lose. And watching you do it, watching you choose love over safety, over approval, over every sensible, reasonable, practical consideration. Her voice broke. It was like watching Daniel walk away all over again. Except this time, I was the one forcing the separation. I was my own parents. I became exactly what destroyed me. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. When the wedding invitation came, I held it for 3 days. Kept picking it up, putting it down. I wanted to be happy for you. Wanted to be the grandmother who showed up with misty eyes and a lace handkerchief and pride in her girl's courage. She shook her head slowly. But every time I pictured myself in that church, watching you marry for love, all I could see was the girl I'd been. The girl who said no when she should have said yes. Who chose a comfortable cage over an uncertain freedom. And the rage, she pressed a hand to her chest. The rage at myself, at my cowardice, it was so big I couldn't breathe around it. I reached for her hand. She pulled back. So I wrote that note. The words came faster now, urgent, like poison she needed to purge. I told myself it was about tradition, about you being too young, about David not being established enough. I dressed it up in all the reasonable concerns a grandmother should have, but it wasn't about any of that. What was it about? My throat felt tight. She finally met my eyes fully, and what I saw there made my chest ache. Shame, deep and corrosive. It was about the fact that I couldn't stand to see my own cowardice reflected back at me. Couldn't stand in that church and watch you claim the happiness I'd thrown away. Every vow you spoke would have been a condemnation of every choice I made. Every time David looked at you the way I'd seen in your face when you talked about him, I would have seen Daniel, would have felt the ghost of what I could have had if I'd been brave. The room felt too small, the air too thin. The refusal wasn't about protecting you or upholding standards or any of the things I told myself late at night when the guilt came calling. Grandmother's voice had gone hoarse. It was about protecting myself from the unbearable pain of witnessing the life I was too weak to choose. She crumpled forward, hands covering her face, and the sobs that came from her were the sounds of something breaking that had been cracked for decades. Not the careful, quiet tears of grief. This was louder, messier, the kind of crying that has no dignity left to preserve. I moved without thinking, gathering her against me the way she'd held me through childhood nightmares. She felt so small, brittle bones and soft skin and 50 years of regret condensed into this fragile frame. "I'm sorry," she gasped against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry. You deserved better. You deserved a grandmother who celebrated your courage instead of punishing you for it. You deserved. SHHH. I smoothed her hair, silver and fine as spider silk. "I'm here, it's all right." But it wasn't all right, not yet. The poison was draining, but the wound was still open. We stayed like that as the sun moved lower, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. Her sobs eventually quieted to shuddering breaths. I felt the dampness of her tears soaking through my shirt, warm and real. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and swollen. She looked utterly spent. "Can you forgive me?" The question came out small, childlike. I thought about the empty chair at my wedding. The 2 years of Thursday visits, sitting on that cold porch while she locked me out. The way David's face had looked when he asked if maybe I should stop trying, stop letting her hurt me week after week. I thought about the girl in the photograph, radiant with love, and the woman she'd become. The choices that had hollowed her out, the price of duty paid in decades of emptiness. "I don't know," I said honestly. She flinched but nodded. "That's fair, but I want to try." I picked up the photograph, studied Daniel's face again. "I want to understand all of it, not just the big moments. I want to know who you were before the choice, who you became after. I want to know my mother's real history." Grandmother looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Hope, maybe, fragile and tentative. "There's more," she said quietly. "Things I never told anyone, about Daniel. About what happened after he left. About—" she hesitated, her gaze sliding to the closet door. "About how the story didn't quite end when I thought it did." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" She reached for the water glass on her nightstand with shaking hands, took a small sip, set it down. When she looked back at me, something flickered in her eyes that I couldn't quite read. 3 years after I married Robert, I got a letter. The silence that followed her confession felt fragile, like ice forming over a river that had finally stopped raging. I sat beside her on the couch, close enough to feel the tremor in her breathing, and reached into my bag. The wedding album was leather-bound, edges soft from my repeated touching. I had carried it with me for 3 Thursdays now, never finding the courage to take it out. My hands shook as I set it between us. She stared at the cover, did not touch it. The afternoon light from the window caught the gold embossing of our names, mine and David's, intertwined. "I want you to see it," I said. My voice came out hoarse. "What you missed." Her fingers twitched toward the album, then pulled back as if the leather might burn her. I watched her jaw work, the muscles in her throat contracting. When she finally reached out, her hand hovered above the cover for 3 long seconds before settling there. The veins stood out beneath her papery skin, blue rivers mapping decades of silence. She opened it. The first photograph showed me in the church vestibule, David's mother adjusting my veil. Grandmother's breath hitched, a small sound that might have been pain or wonder. She turned the page. David and I at the altar, his hand pressed to the small of my back, both of us laughing at something the minister had whispered. Another page. My bouquet of white roses, petals beginning to unfurl. Then she stopped. Her finger traced the edge of a photograph I had almost removed a dozen times. The empty chair in the front row. I had tied a single white ribbon to its back, a placeholder for absence. "I saved it for you," I whispered. She made a sound I had never heard from her before, something broken and animal, a sob wrenched from a place deeper than words. Her shoulders curled inward, collapsing around the weight she had carried alone for 50 years. Tears fell onto the photograph, blurring the image of that empty chair. I reached for her but stopped, uncertain. Then her hand shot out and gripped mine with surprising strength. Her palm was cold, the bones prominent beneath the skin. "I should have been there," her voice cracked. "I should have been there." My own tears came then, hot and sudden. They streamed down my face unchecked, dripping onto the album, onto our joined hands. I could not speak. I could only hold on while she wept, her whole body shaking with the force of grief that had waited decades for permission to surface. The clock in the hallway ticked through minutes that felt suspended, elastic. Outside, a bird called. The furnace hummed. Inside that small living room, two women cried for different losses that were somehow the same. When her sobs finally quieted, she did not let go of my hand. Instead, she lifted her other hand, the one that had been clutching the album, and touched my face. Her fingertips were icy against my flushed cheek, trembling as they traced the line of my jaw, the curve of my chin. She was memorizing me by touch, the way a blind woman might read Braille. "You look like him," she whispered. "Daniel, around the eyes, I never let myself see it before." Her thumb brushed away a tear from beneath my eye. The gesture was so tender it made my chest ache. "I am sorry." The words came out barely audible, shaped more by breath than voice. "Emma, I am so sorry." I turned my face into her palm, pressing my cheek against her hand. "I know. I wasted so much time. You are here now." She withdrew her hand slowly, as if the loss of contact caused physical pain. Her gaze dropped back to the album, to the photograph of David and me cutting the cake, faces bright with joy. She studied it for a long moment, then turned more pages. David twirling me on the dance floor. My friends surrounding us, glasses raised. The church lit by candles as evening fell. "Tell me about him," she said suddenly. I looked up. "What? Your husband." She said the word carefully, testing its weight in her mouth. "Tell me about David." The request stunned me into stillness. In 2 years of Thursday visits, she had never once spoken his name, had flinched every time I mentioned him. Now she waited, eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that felt like desperation. "I do not know where to start," I admitted. "The beginning, then." Her voice was steadier now, though her hands still shook. "How did you meet?" I drew a breath, tasting salt from my tears. "At a bookstore. I was looking for a teaching resource, and he recommended one." We talked for 2 hours in the philosophy aisle without realizing how much time had passed. "What did you talk about?" "Everything. Nothing. Whether happiness was a choice or a circumstance." He argued for choice. I was not convinced. I smiled at the memory. "He spent the next 6 months proving his point." She nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And when did you know that I loved him, that you would marry him, even without your family's blessing?" The question hung between us, sharp-edged and significant. I understood what she was really asking. "When did you become brave enough to choose what I could not?" "There was not one moment," I said carefully. "It was 1,000 small ones. The way he listened when I talked about you, about how much I missed feeling close to you. How he never pressured me to give up on these visits, even when they hurt me. He made space for my grief without trying to fix it." I paused, choosing my next words with precision. "He loved me enough to let me love you, even when you did not love me back." She flinched as if I had struck her. "I always loved you. I know that now." She looked down at the photograph again, at David's face. He was looking at me in the picture, not at the camera, his expression unguarded. "He is handsome. He is patient. Does he make you laugh? Every day. Does he know?" Her voice dropped lower. "About Daniel, about your mother. I told him yesterday after you told me. And he held me while I cried. Then he said it made sense now, why I could not let you go." I swallowed hard. "He said love like that, the kind that survives rejection and silence, is the kind worth fighting for. He said you taught me that, even if you did not mean to." She closed her eyes, fresh tears sliding down the creases of her face. "I taught you nothing but pain. You taught me stubbornness, loyalty. That love is not something you abandon just because it is hard. That is not love, that is imprisonment." Her eyes opened, fierce and bright. "What I had with your grandfather was imprisonment. What Daniel and I could have been was love. What you have with David is love." She gripped the album so tightly the leather creased. "Do you understand the difference?" "Yes. Do you?" She leaned forward, urgent now. "Love does not demand silence. It does not trade freedom for security. It does not punish you for existing." Her voice rose, raw with emotion. "Love lets you breathe." I could not look away from her face. 50 years of suffocation were written there in every line, every shadow beneath her eyes. "When David looks at you in these photographs," she continued, her finger tapping the album, "he is not calculating what you owe him. He is not keeping a ledger of debts. He simply sees you and chooses you over and over." She drew a shaking breath. "That is what I had with Daniel for 2 years. That is what I gave up." "You were young," I said. "You were afraid. I was a coward." The word was harsh, unforgiving. "And I have been a coward every day since. But you," she reached out and gripped my hand again, "you were not. When it mattered, you chose courage." We sat like that, hands clasped, the album open between us. The light through the window had shifted, casting longer shadows across the floor. Somewhere in the house, a pipe creaked. The ordinary sounds of a life continuing. "What would you have done?" she asked quietly. "If you could have gone back, if you had been me, pregnant and terrified with your parents demanding you marry someone else, what would you have done?" The question was a trap and a confession. I thought about it, really considered it before answering. "I do not know," I admitted. "I want to say I would have run away with him. But I have never been that desperate, that alone. You did not have a choice, Grandma, not really." "I did." Her voice was flat. "I chose safety, I chose appearances, I chose survival." She paused. "I did not choose love. You chose your daughter, my mother, you protected her. I smothered her." Her laugh was bitter. "Do you know why your mother moved away the moment she turned 18? Why she never came back, even for holidays?" I shook my head, though I had wondered my entire childhood. "Because she could not breathe here either. She knew something was wrong, even if she did not know what. Children sense lies the way animals sense storms." She looked at me. "When she died, I had not spoken to her in 8 months. We had argued, I do not even remember about what, and I let pride keep me silent. Then she was gone." The revelation hit like a fist to the sternum. My mother had been 23 when she died in a car accident. I had been 5. I had no memory of tension between her and my grandmother, but I had been too young to notice adult fractures. "You raised me," I said. "You could have walked away, but you did not. I tried to do better." her voice cracked. I tried to love you the way I could not love her, but I failed again, did I not? When you needed me most, when you needed me to celebrate your joy, I turned away. You are here now. Am I? She looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The heavy curtains blocking the light. The photographs turned face down on the mantel. The silence that had calcified into habit. Or am I still hiding in this house, pretending the world outside does not exist? I did not have an answer. She turned back to the album, flipping through the remaining pages. The reception. The first dance. David and me driving away, his hand reaching across the seat to hold mine. She touched that last photograph with one finger, gentle as a benediction. He loves you well, she said finally. He does. Then I have one thing to ask of you. She closed the album carefully, smoothing her hand across the cover. Bring him here, next Thursday. Let me meet the man who was brave enough to love you when I was too afraid to show it. My breath caught. You want to meet David? I want to know what love looks like when it is freely chosen. Her eyes met mine, clear and determined despite the tears still drying on her face. I want to see what I might have had if I had been braver, if I had believed I deserved it. The words were both surrender and revolution. I squeezed her hand, my throat too tight for speech. She squeezed back. Will he come? She asked, and for the first time I heard vulnerability instead of ice in her voice. After everything I have done, will he still come? I thought of David, of his patience through 100 Thursday evenings when I came home crying. His quiet support, his refusal to ask me to choose between him and this damaged, stubborn woman who had raised me. Yes, I said, he will come. She nodded once, decisive. Then she did something that stopped my heart. She lifted the album and pressed it to her chest, holding it the way I had seen her clutch Daniel's photograph. Her eyes drifted to something beyond me, beyond the walls of this house, to a past that might have unfolded differently. Do you think he is still alive? She whispered. Daniel, do you think he is out there somewhere, living the life I told him to leave behind? The question opened up a chasm I had not considered. What if he was? What if the man who had loved her, who had fathered my mother without ever knowing it, was still breathing somewhere in the world? I do not know, I said. She smiled then, small and heartbreaking. I like to imagine he found someone, that he had children, grandchildren, that he got to choose love even if I did not. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I hope he was happy. I hope at least one of us got to be happy. The clock struck 5. The sound echoed through the house, marking time that continued despite everything, indifferent to grief and regret and moments of fragile connection. I did not want to leave. I wanted to stay in this space where something had shifted, where my grandmother's hand still held mine, and the possibility of healing hung in the air like the first thaw after a brutal winter. But she was tired. I could see it in the slope of her shoulders, the way her eyelids drooped. She had carried a secret for 50 years, and the telling had cost her something I could not measure. I should go, I said reluctantly. Let you rest. She did not argue, but she did not release my hand immediately either. When she finally did, she touched my face once more, her palm cupping my cheek. Thank you, she said, for not giving up on me. I kissed her forehead, tasting salt. I never will. At the door, I turned back. She was still sitting on the couch, the album open in her lap again, staring at the photograph of that empty chair. Her lips moved, forming words I could not hear. An apology to an absence, or a prayer to a past that could not be rewritten. I closed the door softly behind me and stood on the porch, breathing in the cold air. The dead rose bushes in the yard looked different somehow, less like monuments to decay and more like sleeping things that might wake when spring finally came. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from David. How did it go? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could I explain that something fundamental had broken open? That my grandmother had finally looked at my wedding photos and cried, that she wanted to meet him, that she had asked about a dead man she had loved 50 years ago and might still be searching for. I typed 3 words, "She asked for you." His response came immediately. When? Next Thursday, I wrote. Then, before I could second-guess myself, she wants to know what real love looks like. The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, then I'll show her. I held the phone to my chest and looked back at the house. Through the window, I could see my grandmother's silhouette, still bent over the album, still searching those photographs for something she had lost before I was born. What would she see when she looked at David? Would she find peace in witnessing the love I had chosen? Or would it only sharpen the edges of her regret, showing her in brutal clarity everything she had surrendered? And beneath that question, one more dangerous. If Daniel was still alive somewhere, did she want to know? Or was the not knowing the only thing that had allowed her to survive? I walked to my car, the cold seeping through my jacket. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would be gone in minutes. Beautiful and temporary, like every moment we waste believing we have time. I did not know what would happen next Thursday when David walked through that door. I did not know if my grandmother's request was an olive branch or a goodbye, a beginning or an ending. But I knew this. For the first time in 2 years, she had asked for something, had reached toward the future instead of clutching the past, had wondered out loud what love looked like when you were brave enough to choose it. That had to mean something. That had to mean everything. Thursday arrived with the smell of rain clearing. I gripped David's hand as we climbed the porch steps, his palm warm and steady against my trembling fingers. He had asked only one question when I told him. "Are you sure?" I was. The door opened before I knocked. Grandmother stood in the frame, smaller than I remembered, her cardigan buttoned wrong. Her eyes found David's face and held. The silence stretched until my lungs burned. "You're the teacher," she said finally. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze traveled from his worn shoes to the careful part in his hair. She was cataloging him, measuring him against some invisible standard I couldn't name. David didn't flinch. He simply waited, his thumb tracing small circles on my knuckles. "You make her happy." "I try to every day." Grandmother's throat worked. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." The house smelled of lemon polish and old wood. She had cleaned. The realization hit me like a fist. The curtains were pulled back. Light pooled on the floor in golden squares. On the coffee table sat 3 cups already arranged. We sat. Grandmother poured tea with shaking hands. David reached across the space between them and steadied the pot. "Thank you," she whispered. "My pleasure, Mrs. Margaret." She set the pot down and folded her hands in her lap, knuckles white. I watched her gather herself, brick by brick, the way she'd done my whole life. But this time, something was different. This time, she let the walls crack. "I owe you an apology." Her voice was sandpaper. "I judged you without knowing you. I refused to see what my granddaughter saw. That was cruel." David leaned forward. You were protecting something, I understand that. No, the word came sharp. I was protecting myself. There's a difference. The room fell quiet except for the ticking clock and the drip of the kitchen faucet. Grandmother looked at me, then back at David, and I saw the exact moment she decided to risk everything. She told you. About Daniel. She did. Then you know what I gave up, what I chose instead. Her voice fractured. When Emma brought you to that wedding, when she stood there and chose love over everything else, I couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear to watch someone have what I threw away. David's hand found hers, just rested there, covering her twisted fingers with his steady grip. Grandmother stared at their joined hands like she'd never seen such a thing. "But you're here now," he said simply. She nodded, tears cutting tracks down her papery cheeks. "I'm here." I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight, so I did the only thing I could. I pulled the folded paper from my pocket and slid it across the table. Grandmother's eyes dropped to the elegant script. "What is this?" "An invitation," I managed, "to a vow renewal ceremony. Small, just the chapel and a few friends. I want you to see it this time. I want you to be there when I choose him again." Her hands shook as she lifted the paper. She read it once, twice, then pressed it to her chest. "You would do this for me? I would do this with you." The difference hung in the air between us. Grandmother folded the invitation with careful, deliberate movements and tucked it into her cardigan pocket. When she looked up, her eyes were clear. "I'll need a few weeks to prepare." Spring came slowly, then all at once. The trees outside the chapel burst into white blossoms that carpeted the ground like snow. I stood in the small dressing room, adjusting the same dress I'd worn 2 years ago, and wondered if Grandmother would actually come. David appeared in the doorway. "She's here." My heart lurched. "You saw her." "She's sitting in the front row. Left side." He crossed to me and pressed his forehead to mine. "Breathe," I breathed. The chapel was full of afternoon light. Our friends filled half the pews, their faces warm and familiar. But I only saw her. Grandmother sat alone in the front row, wearing a navy suit I'd never seen before. Her hair was pinned back. Her hands rested in her lap. As I walked down the aisle, her gaze never left my face. When I passed her row, I saw it. The corner of a photograph, peeking from the edge of her jacket, pinned inside against her heart. Daniel was here too. The ceremony blurred. I heard David's voice making promises he'd already kept. I heard my own voice, steadier this time, speaking vows I understood better now. I heard the minister pronounce us bound again, as if we'd ever been anything else. Then Grandmother stood. She moved toward us slowly, each step deliberate. When she reached David, she stopped. For a terrible moment, I thought she might turn away. Instead, she opened her arms. David stepped into her embrace. Grandmother held him like she was drowning, and he was solid ground. Her shoulders shook. David's hand came up to cradle the back of her head, gentle and sure, and I watched my husband hold the woman who had refused him, who had rejected us, who had finally found her way back. When they parted, Grandmother cupped his face in her palms. "Take care of her," she whispered. "Take care of each other. I promise." She turned to me. Her fingers found my cheek, traced the path of tears I hadn't felt fall. "I'm so sorry I missed the first time. I'm so grateful I didn't miss this." I pulled her close. She smelled like lavender and old grief finally loosening its grip. "You're here now," I echoed David's words. "That's what matters." Outside, cherry blossoms drifted through golden light. Grandmother stood between us as cameras clicked, one hand in mine, one hand in David's. When she smiled, it was small and tentative, like something just learning how. But it was real. For the first time in 50 years, it was real.